Hello and welcome to the first review of Request Month 2018. This is Prey, the original from 2006, for PC, Mac, Linux, and Xbox 360. What you're seeing here is of course the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Human Head Studios and originally published by 2K, although Bethesda now owns the rights to the license, and it was first released for PC and Xbox 360 in 2006, and later saw releases on Mac and Linux. Now, the history of this game's development is actually rather long and complicated, so I'm going to give you a relatively summarized version. The actual development started in 1995, and the project was almost nothing like it turned out to be in the 2006 release. At the time they were developing the game, they were running into lots of technical problems, particularly with the portal technology that they were trying to implement, and eventually somewhere around 1999 or 2000 it got put on indefinite hold, although 3D Realms would later pick up the project again on the new id Tech 4 engine, which is probably better known to most gamers out there as the Doom 3 engine, and they would have Human Head Studios developing it. Now, if you don't know who Human Head Studios are, they actually developed the classic hack-and-slash game Rune. So they took over the project and basically rebuilt it from the ground up as a brand new game. There were certainly things that did carry over from the original builds of the game, but by and large what you're dealing with here is a production that was pretty much entirely done by Human Head Studios. And when the game finally did release, it was generally very well received and it seemed to sell quite well. 3D Realms was quite happy with the sales of the game being over 1 million copies, and they ultimately greenlit a sequel that never ended up happening. The rights to Prey would ultimately be sold over to Bethesda, who would put the series in the hands of the talented developers Arcane Studios, who, if you don't know, are responsible for Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, Arx Fatalis, and the Dishonored series, and they would go on to make a complete reboot of the franchise that was simply titled Prey and had basically nothing to do with the original game. Thus, you end up with a very large amount of backlash for the reboot that was mostly centered around the fact that it wasn't actually Prey 2 and was instead a complete reboot. But that's something for another video. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out whether or not it still holds up so many years after its release and whether it's actually worth playing. Well, as far as presentation goes, as I mentioned before, it does run on id Tech 4, which is the Doom 3 engine, and that does show in many regards. If you've played Doom 3 or Quake 4, then it's going to look pretty similar to those in terms of its general style and its general effects. The real star of the show with that engine was actually the lighting effects, and that's no exception here. The lighting effects still actually look quite fantastic, although the rest of the visuals are certainly looking a bit dated by modern standards, particularly with regards to the modeling occasionally being a bit blocky and the animations being a bit sluggish. Then of course there's the texture work, which was generally pretty solid for 2006, but these days is looking rather dated. But here's the thing, it's not so much the visual quality here that's important, it's more the art style, which is a pretty unique art style in the grand scheme of first-person shooters. On the one hand, it is heavily inspired by Native American mythology, so you have a lot of that factoring in, but in terms of the raw sci-fi aesthetic, everything has a sort of organic and industrial look at the same time, which you don't really see very often in first-person shooters, or really in video games in general. This means that, if nothing else, Prey's visuals certainly stand out from the crowd, even though their quality isn't exactly the best anymore. But then you move past the visuals and you get into the sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier, because on the one hand, you have sound effects which are just alright. I mean, they do their job decently enough, but aren't particularly impressive. With gun and explosion sounds that aren't particularly beefy, although they do still have at least some punch to them, so there is that. It's just that there's almost no variety to them as well. So when you're actually using the various weapons, they just tend to get rather repetitive very quickly. Moving on from the sound effects, you get into the music, which was done by Jeremy and Julian Sewell, so in this case it means that the soundtrack is perfectly fitting for a cinematic score, and it's definitely some solid orchestral stuff that's almost a bit too epic for what's going on in the game. This is something I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay, but sometimes the sweeping orchestral tracks that denote what should be an absolutely massive amount of action don't really fit with what's actually going on screen. But regardless of whether or not the game is actually able to deliver on what the soundtrack is promising, the soundtrack itself is still very solid. Then of course there's the voice acting, which generally speaking is fairly strong. I mean, the main character, Tommy, is voiced by Michael Greyeyes, and his girlfriend Jen is voiced by Crystal Lightning, both of whom are actually Native Americans, so that does actually lend a fair bit of authenticity to the voice acting, and they generally do a pretty solid job with what they're given. It's just that sometimes the script really gets in the way of that. But the rest of the cast does a pretty solid job with the voice acting as well, although the antagonist is incredibly irritating, but that's more from an actual writing standpoint than simply a voice acting standpoint. The actress did a decent enough job with what she had. So when you bring all the presentation together, what you have is something that still holds up pretty well because it was very solid in its time, and there are certain elements of the visuals in particular that still hold up extremely well, namely the lighting. But here's the thing, what really matters is not the presentation, but rather the story and the gameplay. The story is that you play as the Cherokee mechanic Tommy, who lives on a reservation out west and is trying to get away from the reservation with his girlfriend Jen. You see, Tommy pretty much rejects his own culture, and he really does not want to stay anywhere near his own homelands and wants to instead go out into the wider world and do his own thing, whereas Jen wants to stay on the reservation because she's considerably more attached to her own culture and her people. But all of that is torn apart when, after an argument at the bar where Jen works, they end up getting pulled into a spaceship called the Sphere. It's actually one of the more awesome openings in video game history, but once you get past that opening, things take a decidedly more predictable turn. Because obviously the first motivation Tommy's going to have is to find his girlfriend and of course his grandfather, who was also pulled up into the ship, and to try to get all three of them out. But things don't really go to plan, and his grandfather ends up actually getting killed, and he ends up having to go off and find Jen on his own. As he's going through the ship and trying to find her, he ends up awakening a spiritual power from within, and his grandfather explains to him in the spirit world that he is actually a spiritual warrior, able to take on a spirit form and walk outside of his actual physical body and, of course, take on more spiritual threats. But here's where the main problem of the story comes into play. Tommy doesn't want anything to do with that. All he wants, which he constantly reminds you of, I might add, is to find Jen and go home. In fact, he does this so often, and so often rejects his grandfather's advice, and so often just comes across as this whiny bitch that he becomes one of the most unlikable protagonists in video game history. You probably think to yourself, if you haven't played the game, oh, he can't possibly be that bad. But there's no exaggeration here. The entire game, Tommy does basically nothing but whine and complain, and he just becomes insufferable. And if it were just Tommy complaining, then I'd be able to put up with that. It's irritating, but I can deal with it. What makes the story impossible to deal with is that both Tommy and the antagonist are completely insufferable. You see, the main antagonist has a telepathic link with Tommy, and thus is able to communicate with him in his head throughout the entire game. Now you see, this could have been used to make the antagonist much more threatening and menacing, but instead, it's used to make her so cartoonish that she actually becomes insulting to your intelligence. It is the absolute bog-standard antagonist thinking that they are the most superior being in the entire universe with omniscience and omnipotence, even though the main protagonist is tearing through their armies like they're made of tissue paper and is perfectly fine kinda deal. It wouldn't be so much of a problem if the storyline didn't take itself so damn seriously. It is very much convinced that it is a serious work of sci-fi, and instead, it's just laughable cartoon gibberish. And really, if it weren't so annoying about that fact, then it would actually be kind of funny, but the sad part is, you can't even laugh at it because both the protagonist and the antagonist are so irritating to deal with. And once you get past them, the actual story is not only incredibly predictable, but it's actually very bare bones. The idea is that the Sphere shows up and it pulls a bunch of inhabitants off of a planet in order to process them for either more soldiers, or it actually just processes them into food or fuel, and then it moves on to the next planet and does that thing again, and just eventually repeats its cycle over and over again, to the point where the ancestors basically call them the Dark Ones, and it's this ancient alien threat that needs to be dealt with. Of course, Tommy doesn't want anything to do with that, he just wants to find his girlfriend and go home, so he's constantly even rejecting the storyline of his own game. But anyway, the point is that not only is the story predictable, but by the time it ends, you're like, this is going to end on a cliffhanger. And guess what? It ended on a cliffhanger, which I'm sure is the technical reason for the hashtag not my prey when you're talking about the reboot of the series, but let's face it, the story in this game was garbage. It does have some really cool elements to it, like the whole spirit warrior idea, where Tommy is going back and forth between the spirit world and dealing with that sort of thing. And it does leave the game open for a sequel or multiple sequels, but those sequels would have barely anything, if anything, to do with the original game, so it's not like there's any great loss from not having a direct sequel to the events of Prey. Now, of course, you may be wondering at this point, well, if the story and the characters aren't holding up the game, then what is? Well, the gameplay is where things get a lot more interesting, more specifically in the level design, which is some of the most creative level design I have seen in a first-person shooter. Most of the environments you're in are going to be pretty cramped, which is what you would expect from an EdTech 4-engine game, but at the same time, there are a lot of areas that do open up as well and allow you to either hop into a vehicle or to just run around in a fairly large area for a while. But what makes the levels interesting is how they play with gravity, with these magnetized walkways where you can walk along ceilings and over walls and everything at weird angles, as well as the spirit walking form and the portals. I'll start with the portals. So when you walk up to certain objects, you'll notice that there's this kind of odd sheen to them where it shows a different section of level, and you might be thinking, oh, well, that's just some visual screen that's showing a different part of the level. In reality, it's not actually a screen, it's a portal to that particular section of the level, and you will have to use those to navigate the various areas that you're going through. Sometimes the portals are just a one-way ticket and you just keep going to the next section of the level. Sometimes they're a portal to the next area of the game entirely, where it'll actually have to go through a loading screen to get there. Sometimes they're just a portal to somewhere else within the area that you're already in. Regardless, both in concept and in execution, they make the levels a lot more interesting. And when you combine that with these magnetized walkways where you can enable them to walk along areas of the map that you normally would not be able to, as well as these gravity generators, which if you shoot them will actually flip the gravity to whatever surface they're on, makes even the simplest navigation in this game incredibly interesting. And then on top of that, they throw in the spirit form. Now, in your spirit form, not only do you have a different health bar represented by the blue health meter instead of the red health meter, and not only are you much more effective against spiritual enemies than against physical enemies, but you also get the ability to walk on various constructions that are only in the spirit world, and you can use those to access different areas of the levels that you normally would not be able to access. And on top of that, you can use the spirit form to walk through force fields and access areas that, again, would not be physically accessible in your normal form. And all of that put together makes the level design extremely interesting, because you're always looking for different ways you can use the environment to get to where you're trying to go. And it ultimately makes the level design more of a puzzle than simply, oh, well, it's an area for you to run around in and shoot stuff in. But unfortunately, this cleverness of level design tends to peter out toward the end of the game when you are introduced to vehicles which allow you to move around in very large areas, and the design of the levels ends up becoming a lot more formulaic and considerably less reliant on doing these interesting things with the various magnetic walls as well as the gravity wells and that sort of thing. Not to mention that the vehicle itself is pretty lame. I mean, you fly it around with a trackball in the middle of the console in front of you, and it's not much more than a pod. So you just fly that thing around, you only get one armament when you're flying it around, and it's just this really basic autocannon. And not only does it barely seem to do any damage, but it will take damage like crazy, so you're having to constantly replace it by going back to the pad and hopping in a new one, and it just ends up becoming tiresome. But even though it drags at the end, the level design in the game in general is one of its best selling points, and it is incredibly strong for the most part. But then you realize this isn't just a walking simulator through some incredibly interesting levels. It's a first-person shooter. So how is the shooting? Well, you start the game off with a wrench that's practically useless in a fight, but that's quickly replaced with a basic rifle that acts as a machine gun in its primary fire and a sniper rifle in its secondary fire for considerably higher ammo use. There's an autocannon, which is basically a much more powerful machine gun, but it has a secondary fire of launching grenades. There's a weapon whose primary fire is basically a rocket launcher, but the secondary fire is more of a protective shield. There's a weapon that shoots a spray of acid as its primary fire, or launches the entire tube for a grenade effect as a secondary. Then there are a bunch of three-legged creatures that you find scattered around the levels that you can pick up and use as grenades as their primary fire, or if you use the secondary fire, you switch them over to proximity mine mode. And then finally, there's a gun that will leech power from various sources in order to have 4 different effects, where it'll either be just a basic plasma gun that shoots a bunch of energy balls, or it'll spit out a cloud that freezes enemies at short range, or it'll launch incredibly powerful bolts of lightning, or be a beam of energy that will just do damage over time. So despite the game only having a few weapons, the actual effects are considerably more varied, and the weapon variety ultimately ends up being perfectly fine. Ammo capacity is a bit difficult to judge, however, because instead of it being an actual number listed on the screen, it's a bar that slowly depletes as you continue to expend ammunition. Let's put it this way, there is a reason that the vast majority of first-person shooters out there do not use a bar to denote how much ammunition you have in something. It's just not an efficient way of telling how much ammo you actually have left. Now, of course, you may think that that's not really much of a problem because you can just kind of eyeball how much ammo you have left and work from that, except that all of the enemies in this game are total bullet sponges. Until you get access to some of the much more damaging weapons in the game, which don't really come along until pretty late, actually, then you are dealing with a lot of enemies that will take a lot of rounds to bring down, and even when you do finally get access to the more damaging weapons, you find that the enemies are still bullet sponges. Even the basic grunts take quite a few shots to bring down, and by the time you do get access to those more powerful weapons, the more powerful enemies have come in, and so it just ends up being kind of this constant state of not really being all that difficult, but you are running into a lot of enemies that just take a lot of shots to bring down. That in itself isn't a deal breaker until you factor in the movement speed. You see, more bullet spongy enemies are much more conducive to the older school fast-paced style of gameplay, except that this is not fast-paced at all. You move extremely slowly in this game. Game developers, hear me out. If you are making an action-packed first-person shooter, do not make the walking speed equivalent or slower than that of a walking simulator, where you are meant to take in all of the sights and do things very slowly. Particularly on the larger levels, this becomes incredibly irritating to deal with just because it takes a very long time to get from point A to point B, and a lot of times there won't really be all that much to break up the monotony, except maybe 1 or 2 enemies that they throw in your way, and which are generally hilariously easy to dispatch even though it might take you quite a few bullets to do it. This ultimately means that even though the level design is extremely interesting, the actual first-person shooting mechanics, the movement speed, and the shooting itself just drag everything else down. And it really doesn't help that the game is simply too easy. I mean, it is impossible to die in this game. If you die, then you go into the spirit world, where you have to shoot at various flying spirits until eventually you replenish your health enough to be able to go back into the real world. It's a somewhat interesting idea, except that, again, it just makes the game way too easy, and as a result, you end up with a first-person shooter that not only is extremely tedious to go through, but it's also just way too easy, which ultimately results in the game simply being boring. And it's a real shame because, like I said before, this is some of the most creative and clever level design I have ever seen in a first-person shooter, but when you actually try to assess it as a first-person shooter, beyond the level design, it's a mess. I can see where the game developed a cult following because of the unique elements of the whole spirit walking mechanic as well as the wildly cool level design, but when you get down to it, it's just not a very good first-person shooter, and that ultimately kills it. I ultimately give Prey a 2 out of 5. As cool as the level design is, it just can't save the game from being a very wimpy first-person shooter. Thanks for watching.